how do people really learn? At a Newspring, we create experiences with leading learning pioneers like Dr. Felipe Hartman, Julie Dirksen, and Lauren Waldman to explore just that and more. Don't miss our next Love to Learn experience, an event series to help and inspire you to create training based on how people learn best. Find out what's coming up at anewspring.com/events.
If you're in workplace learning, Learning Technologies 2025 should definitely be on your radar. It's happening 23rd to 24th of April at Excel London, and the scale is huge. 11,000 visitors, 1,000 conference delegates, and a free exhibition with over 200 L&D solution suppliers. The conference theme, People, Technology in the Future, Decision Time, taps into the biggest topics in L&D right now. With 80 expert speakers and 30 sessions, they'll cover AI, skills, personal growth, and practical L&D essentials. Booking opens at the end of January. Check out learningtechnologies.co.uk for more info. What does Nick Shackleton-Jones think of the body of theory that underpins modern learning?
Having actually taught learning theory, we're still in a very proto-scientific stage. It's a patchwork of bits and bobs. Nobody quite knows what to make of it. It's awful. It's just chaos out there.
It's chaos. Welcome to The Learning Hack, a podcast about the people and technologies that are creating the future of learning. I'm John Helmer.
Now guess what? Learning is cool. Learning is cool. Learning is cool. I'm learning. Learning is fun.
Knowledge is power. Knowledge. Education.
Hack Facts. Nick Shackleton-Jones is CEO and founder of Shackleton Consulting and the author of How People Learn, an enduringly popular book that has been enormously influential in workplace learning. Beginning life as a psychology lecturer, he has since held high-profile CLO posts with Deloitte UK, BBC, BP and PA Consulting Group, and now runs his own consultancy. Nick is well known in the corporate learning industry for his groundbreaking work and thinking, and was included in our other podcast series, Great Minds on Learning, as a great mind. But though my co-host Donald Clark evidently considers him a great mind, Nick himself is not all that comfortable with the label.
It's very flattering. I don't think we really know who is and isn't a great mind until, decades, possibly centuries later. You shouldn't ever dub yourself. I mean, flattering as it might be. I think that's a judgment that history makes.
Whatever. One thing he is a great podcast guest, and it was brilliant to have him on again. We had a thought-provoking and wide-ranging discussion. Prepare to have your preconceptions overturned, and be sure to stay tuned to the end. Nick's take on the future of AI really surprised me. Nick, it's great to have you back on the podcast, and welcome to The Learning Hack.
Thanks for having me back.
Well, you last appeared on the podcast 5 years ago, so I think it's well overdue, really, to have a catch-up on what's been going on with you since then, but also some of the stuff that's happened in the wider world, a lot. That initial interview was just before the pandemic, so if we think back those 5 years of the stuff that's happened there, and, even the stuff that happened yesterday, I have to say, I love your TikTok, which you didn't have at that time. TikTok didn't exist. And it gives us a chance to see a different side of your thought and personality. I'd love to know what you think of TikTok as a learning medium, but I just want to give people who haven't seen it a flavour of it. So I'm going to ask you this. I'm going to say, Nick, can I ask you a question?
I mean, you can ask me a question. You've just asked me a question.
Okay, can I ask you another question?
Well, that is another question. So look, I can see that this is like an infinite regress immediately. So perhaps you should just kind of set out your questioning, format before we sort of get into it. You could say, perhaps, I'm going to ask you two questions. The first of which is whether or not I'm permitted to ask you a second question, and contingent on the answer to the first, I will then answer the substantive question, namely the second. That would be the right way to say that, obviously.
Yeah, but I think that's going to give people a flavour of the TikTok. You either send them running for TikTok now or else running for the hills, I think.
Yeah, pedantry.
Yeah, if Wittgenstein had had a TikTok, it might have been a bit like that, but, probably a bit more David Lynch-like if he'd done it. But anyway, I think it's a really interesting thing. But so I will ask you a serious question now. What do you think of TikTok as a learning medium?
I think it is the most successful learning platform that we've ever seen. I was looking at some of the stats on TikTok, and the average consumption of the average kind of TikTok user is, I think, hundreds of minutes a day. So it's not just like YouTube and Google, where people go and they have a look at this, that, the other. It is sort of addictive. And the reason that it is addictive is because it's a learning platform, which people say, oh, no, it's not, that's rubbish. But it's because, look, learning in its essence is driven by what you care about. I've been rabbiting on about that for years.
Yeah.
So
effective context.
The success of TikTok is due to the fact that people find stuff on there and the algorithm aligns stuff with their interests. It does two interesting things, really. Firstly, it says, oh, we know that you're interested in this. And secondly, it pushes you stuff that you might be interested in as well, which I think is fascinating. So I've learned all about things that I never knew I would be interested in, like magnet fishing. But the reason people don't like it is because it's not education. Because with education, you say, you ought to be interested in this. You ought to be interested in maths and geography and history. And of course, kids aren't. But with TikTok, it says, oh, you're interested in makeup and what's on trend and what's funny. And it just aggressively aligns content with your interests. And yeah, I mean, people are learning a huge amount. Of course, people moan and wring their hands about it and say, oh, it's a waste of time and this, that, the other. But everything can be a waste of time. You can waste time on the internet. Of course, you can waste time on TikTok. But it is a fantastically efficient learning platform, is what I think.
There's one aspect of that it's a bit of a Rorschach test in a way, in that no, your TikTok isn't the same as the TikTok that you see isn't the same as TikTok I see. TikTok is a reflection of what you look at, what you're interested in. And so if you really want, if what you want from something like TikTok is titillation, that's what you'll get. So it does kind of send you back to people like Simon Brown saying that we need to work on people's curiosity, because, if you're a curious person, it does become a learning platform. Perhaps if you're less curious, it doesn't.
Yeah, I understand that challenge. I think it's about becoming your own parent. I think education historically was a very parent-child model. It was sit down, shut up. We're the parents. We're going to tell you what you should learn. And in a world where you don't have that authoritarian position, which is kind of the educational position, some people just go nuts. They just go off and waste a bunch of time. But I think that's healthy. Internalizing your parent and actually being able to, it's the same with dieting. It's like, well, yeah, I mean, if you don't have a parent saying, eat this, eat that, and all of a sudden you've got a little bit of cash, you could just eat McDonald's every day. And some people do. But it's about having that kind of discipline, looking after yourself, saying, well, I should balance my digital diet in some way. It's fine to spend a little bit of time looking at this, but I ought to spend some time on some edifying stuff as well. But, it's surprising. A lot of that edifying stuff is, I spend a lot of time listening to people talk about philosophy. I don't do that because I'm trying to force feed myself philosophy because I think it will make me better, because I'm genuinely kind of interested in it. So I think yes and no. I think different people will use and abuse platforms like TikTok and the internet and YouTube according to their nature.
So we've got right into it there. Take a step back. Can you fill in the blanks for us on your career? You were a highly successful CLO at the time we last talked.
Sure.
You've got kind of a dream CV for a CLO, really, and you've since made the move to go freelance. Prompted that change. How do you reflect on the differences between being corporate prince a gun for hire, and
Yeah.
what are you working on to achieve for clients now in your consultancy work? I mean, that's kind of three questions in one, so I can give up now and just sit here and
Well, I mean, you asked lots of questions, so the risk is that I just
Yeah.
kind of answer them all and talk too much. But I would recommend jumping around into different kinds of roles, and I did a fair amount of that. So I had the benefit. I started off in academia, psychology lecturer, as you say, went into corporate, saw too much of corporate life, and then went into consulting, which is such a big step, and went from kind of client facing into Deloitte. So I was at PA Consulting with most of my team, and then I was recruited into Deloitte as CLO. And I think those different kinds of shifts, obviously you kind of learn a lot from them, and you have the opportunity to kind of reinvent yourself. I'm not sure if I was successful as CLO. I did some things that I'm proud of. Actually, we won an award for something I might mention, but also it was a really tough time. And so the story it's an interesting story, I think. I joined with impeccable timing, literally the day before lockdown. So I had thought that it would be this sort of big, sort of exciting job, meeting interesting people, traveling the world, as you might expect. But actually what happened is I turned up on the first day of the job and was alone in this big glass and steel building in central London. It was just me and the facilities manager, because everybody else had been told to go home to practice for, some kind of, working from home response. So I was sat there like a prune in my get-up, polished shoes, my badge, thinking, oh, this is a bit weird. And then, of course, we all got sent home with our laptops. And I thought, we can do this. We know how to do Zoom calls. We'll do this for a couple of weeks. It will be fine. It wasn't fine. Some of us perhaps forgotten that in the early days of the pandemic, we only thought it was going to last a couple of weeks, couple of months. But it's still burned into my memory because I had to keep pushing back courses. I kept saying, oh, no, we'll be able to run the course in September, whatever. In the end, I didn't meet my team. I had a big team. In total, the team's about 85, 84. And a couple of things happened. First is I had to go through a restructure that team. If you do a big job like that, you shouldn't moan about things like that, because there's always something like that you have to do. It was just a really tough thing to do during the pandemic when you were doing it remotely and people were already terrified of dying. And then you're talking to them about a reorganization. I didn't enjoy that. I don't think I was very good at it. We did do we took the opportunity to do some hugely innovative stuff, like we redesigned the induction. We won awards for that. But the question that changed my life, and I made a TikTok about this, was a lot of my work is experience design. I try and design better induction experiences or leadership learning experiences. And I found myself sat in this room doing an average, I calculated it, 13, I think, calls a day, because they were like half-hour slots. So this feels like a terrible experience. I mean, for me, I'm a sort of deeply introverted, to say the least. And I could just, by midday, it was like an out-of-body experience. I could see myself talking, but I wasn't really there. And I thought, this is terrible. I've done something awful with my life if I pride myself on being an experienced designer and it looks like I'm working in a contact center. So I think I'm a reluctant entrepreneur. So you won't hear all this blather from me about, glamorizing entrepreneurship. I never really wanted to do it. I just thought, I can't do this. Whatever it means running my own business, I'm going to have to do that.
I think that's such an interesting perspective. And I was interested particularly in that TikTok, the idea that as an experienced designer, what's the experience that you've designed for yourself at work?
Yeah.
I had a stroke last year, a minor stroke, and that did cause me to think quite a lot about, what is the life that I've given myself, and is it the right life, and so on, to make adjustments and so on. I think it's, probably happens to a lot of people, but it's probably particularly the case if, as you say, you are an experienced designer. So moving on from that, you've now become a freelancer. How do you reflect on the difference between freelancing and, which in my experience has its own terrors, and having a kind of day job, which I've done as well?
It does have its own terrors. You're quite right. And I'd be interested in your experiences. I think, the answer is every role has its pros and cons. If you're in corporate, basically the problem with the corporate is burning your life. It is burning its way through your life because routine just evaporates memory-wise, psychologically speaking, anything that isn't unusual or extraordinary. And what corporates tend to do is slot you into a predictable routine role in a given set of blah, 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 blah. And they are burning through years of your life. You can spend 10 years sitting at a desk at a cubicle in an office and you won't remember any of it. So that, but there's the security. So often people, I think, exchange their life for security in this kind of weird economy of experience. And then there's a kind of, startup, and then there's consulting, which is different again. But I think to answer your question, a couple of things spring to mind. Firstly, there is, as you know, the feast and famine. So you never quite know, where the work is coming from. So sometimes you get very quiet periods and then sometimes very busy periods. I was talking to Russell Butler, who'd been running this iVentive sort of series, and they were doing really well. They had a little bit of cash in the bank, and then the pandemic hit. What do you do? So that's one thing. The other thing is that the clients tend to shape your business. I think a lot of naive entrepreneurs think, oh, the joy of it will be I'll do just what I want to do. But the reality is it's a bit like consulting. Your clients, at least in the early stages, will tell you, we need you to do this. And it might not be quite what you had in mind, but that's not all bad, And I think the big advantage for me is variety. I've got back from Geneva last night. I'm looking a bit ragged. And working with a client there, doing really interesting things around their kind of sales strategy and delivering experiences as part of a leadership in technology program. And I love that variety. I think it keeps me alive, and it certainly makes for kind of stories and rich memories.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. The variety is great. Yeah. And reflecting on kind of having a day job, I've been watching Severance recently, which I don't know if you've seen that. It's on Apple TV, which is sort of ostensibly a dystopic future science fiction view of a company where basically people, without any spoilers, their brains are severed between their work selves and their home selves. Actually, it feels more like a kind of satire on working life as it is. We're completely different people in the office to the people we are at home, and that feeling of being a split and severed personality is something that comes into it. But as we say, freelancing has its own horrors. To talk about what you're actually doing in your freelancing at the moment, what's 5DI? I very sorry to admit, I haven't had time to kind of dig into it very much. I don't know very much about it, but it sounds interesting. Always interested in a model, always slightly suspicious of models, as you are yourself, I think. What's 5DI?
Yeah, funny, isn't it? How you answer that question depends on who you think the audience is. So if you're pitching it to a client, if you're talking to a fellow L&D person, if you're speaking philosophically, you give different answers. So perhaps I'll sort of skate around a little bit. If I were talking to somebody who wasn't really interested in learning development, but was interested in business, I would say it's an answer to two big problems in L&D, which have dogged us for decades. One is, how do you get a return on investment, for learning development programs? And the second is, how do you actually get learners, people in a business, interested and engaged in learning? Because these are two problems that I've seen. If you've been to learning conferences, I'm sure people talking about, the problem of measuring ROI. And secondly, people saying, well, how do we get learners engaged, and, how do we market stuff and all this stuff? And the answer to the first problem is basically you're never going to see a return on investment, because what you're doing is just Morris dancing. The problem is not the difficulty measuring it, which is what people point the finger at. The problem is that, if you're Morris dancing, there isn't a return on investment. So it's like, how do you actually do something worthwhile where you would see return on investment? And the second is, often learners are blamed. We have this sort of blame the victim attitude, I think, in L&D. It's like, they're not, how do you get them to be self-directed? Of course, they're self-directed. They're on TikTok, they're on YouTube, they're on Google. They're watching people do stuff all day long. It's just that your stuff is not relevant. That's the problem. It's feedback for you if they're not consuming your stuff. So how does 5DI fix that? Well, 5DI is a human-centered design approach. And basically, it fixes it by doing two things. Firstly, you talk to the business and say, what are the actual outcomes of this program at the top, if you like? How would people be thinking, feeling, and behaving differently? Because if you haven't had that conversation, if somebody just said, could you put this stuff in a course, and you did it, what were you expecting would happen? It's like, so say, okay, stop. Before we start putting topic and documents and content in a module, can you just tell me, what would you expect to see people be doing and feeling and thinking differently? But let's start there, because then if we know what we're trying to achieve. So let's say, for example, people want a greater sense of belonging. Don't need any content. Just need to get them together in a room with their colleagues. You can build a sense of belonging without having to do anything instructional at all. So there are real business outcomes that you can achieve without going down that horrible kind of instructional design, educational route. And the second thing you do that's different is you talk to people. Anyone would do that. If you're developing a product, you go out to your audience and say, hey, what are you struggling with? What are you doing day to day? And you use those two bits of data, the top down, what outcomes does the business want? What is it that people care about? What are they doing? You use those to drive the design. It's a data-driven design approach. So it's sort of common sense, I think, in a way, but it's because much of what we do in the industry is so religious, so ritualized, that it seems radical to be kind of talking good sense. So I appreciate I've sort of sold it a little bit there. But basically it's about how to get results, and it's a systematic design process. And because we're doing it for a long time, and this is the last thing I'll say, there's lots of free tools and techniques and stuff out there. So it's quite easy. Now, I think it's becoming easier for organizations to take the step away from ADDIE and all that nonsense towards actually doing something worthwhile.
If you're looking to connect with the top minds in learning and talent, there's no better place than an iVentiv event. That's IVENTIV. Since 2009, they've hosted nearly 300 interactive conversational events exclusively for senior leaders like global heads of learning. I've been a sponsor myself and found these events invaluable. Less about sitting and listening, more about real, impactful conversations. It's an unmatched opportunity to collaborate with leading chief learning officers on the challenges they're tackling today. Join the conversation. Visit iventiv.com/learninghack. That's iventiv.com/learninghack.
I'm interested in the Morris dancing comparison, because, of course, what's the ROI of Morris dancing? Well, at the time that it was actually done as a, pre-19th century or back in the Middle Ages or whatever, as a serious kind of ritualistic practice, the outcome was we had a great harvest. It worked.
Yeah.
It's kind of to pacify I don't know exactly what's going on there, but there is some kind of cause and effect and ROI over that. Do you think there's a kind of magical thinking about in the training world, really, about, we do the training, we do all these courses, and look, we're a thriving enterprise, so let's not dig into it too much.
Yeah, I mean, imagine a parallel universe where instead of a training team, every organization has a feng shui team. Feng shui is this ancient art, mystical art of reorganizing the position of things in a room to create better kind of energy. And so they have this feng shui team, 12 people, and every year they do this sort of needs analysis. How much feng shui do you need? And, they go to different parts of the business, move things around. They collect happy sheets, like surveys, like, did you feel it made your experience better? And people say, yes, generally it did. And then somebody says, well, what's the ROI on this team? And they say, it's very difficult to measure. It's a very complicated thing to measure, the ROI. But every organization has a feng shui team because that's just what you do. And people generally seem to like it. And they have this systematic kind of demand planning process year on year. The other analogy I use is pizza. If you don't like that, you could have a pizza team, internal pizza team. You could track consumption of it. You could track the efficiency of the pizza distribution, and people would say they like it, and it, makes work a better place. Yeah, great, okay. But is it actually doing any good?
The other thing about what you say about 5DI that occurs to me is it sounds a bit like organizational design, OD. And I've been talking to Teresa Rose, who says she doesn't do L&D anymore, she just does OD. Do you feel that's is that on the money, that comparison? Or
Think so. I think that the thing that I want to say, I suppose, in a way about 5DI is it's the first model that's really based on a theory of learning. Having actually taught learning theory, we're still in a very proto-scientific stage. It's a patchwork of bits and bobs. Nobody quite knows what to make of it. Everybody wants to jump on evidence-based, practices, which is a terrible idea because that's not how science works. You don't go from a piece of research to doing something. That's just nonsense. You'll have everybody carrying lemons around because you read some research that says, perfectly true, citrus fruits improve memory. So it's awful. It's just chaos out there. So I think I realized this very early on and set about creating a basis for actually doing stuff that was going to make a difference that stemmed from a testable kind of theory. And I think that's the bit that people sort of don't look too closely at because they're in a hurry to work to a kind of a process. But to answer your question, is it OD? One of the things that 5DI does is it essentially spits out two kinds of things: performance support, like resources and guides, which is effectively learning elimination. And the other is experience design, which is kind of learning proper, but probably has no content involved. And that's quite something to get your head around, because a lot of learning people don't really like the idea that if they want to serve their organization, probably the quickest, fastest way to do that is through eliminating the need to learn. So it's like, well, am I a learning eliminator? Is that what I really do? And the second thing is, okay, so if you're doing experience design, very little of that involves any content. And that's very unsettling. When we redesigned you might think this sounds mystical, but when you redesigned the induction program at Deloitte, there was a performance support bit, a digital thing, and then there was an experience which is 5 days long, which you had to do over Zoom. And my instruction to the team was there should be no content in the experience. And they found that a really tough thing to get their heads around. But in the end, it was a big part of the success of the program. But you see what I mean? I think that, yes, 5DI does push you in directions which you wouldn't conventionally think are education. But are they OD? Probably not quite that far.
So I'm glad you talk about learning theory there, because it makes a good bridge to the next question. My co-host Donald Clark on our other podcast, Great Minds on Learning, featured you as a great mind. And coming from Donald, praise is always a good thing. I'm not saying he's miserly with praise, but he's very discriminating about who he thinks is only good. So if there is a canon of important contemporary learning theorists, and when we looked at it, it seemed there really isn't much of a canon. But if there was one, as far as Donald's concerned, at least, you're definitely in it, and I concur with that. So I'm going to assume that people have at least a passing acquaintance with your effective context model. We've kind of touched on some of the themes in that, and your resources, not courses, work on performance support. To what extent have you changed or developed your thinking about any of these in the last 5 years? I think you recently revised or reissued your book.
Yeah.
I wonder, that must have given you an opportunity to look at that again. What's changed?
I think it's super interesting, to me at least. It's very flattering. I don't think we really know who is and isn't a great mind until, decades, possibly centuries later. If you look at the sorts of people who win Nobel Prizes, some of them turn out to be great minds, and some of them turn out to be just complete crackpots, and they win Nobel Prizes for stuff which is nonsense. So I think that you shouldn't ever dub yourself. I mean, flattering as it might be, I think that's a judgment that history makes. But I think that there comes a point, especially as you get older, that you realize either because time is running out or because you grow in confidence, that you just need to speak your mind and not care too much about whether or not, you're a great mind or not. So yeah, how has my thinking changed? I think that in the first edition of the book, I thought that the effective context model was the theory of learning, the first kind of general. I've been quite clear about this. It still might sound strange to some people, but the first kind of general theory of learning. By the time I got around to writing the second book, I think I realized that what I discovered was not just a general theory of learning, but a general theory of cognition. And much more of the second book is about more general topics like language, about relationships, about ethics, and beginning to think about how this understanding of human beings sets a path for the future. And one of the things that I discovered is that there's this sort of perceptual set phenomenon, which is people see what they're looking for. So the vast majority of people reading that book still see it very much as a book about training and about designing learning. But from my perspective, that's not really at all what it's about. That's a camouflage. So interesting. The analogy I sometimes use, I know it's self-aggrandizing, but let's set that aside, is when Darwin first published The Origin of Species, his editor thought he was publishing a book about pigeon breeding, because that's basically how Darwin discovered it wasn't the Galapagos Islands. He was an avid pigeon breeder, as a lot of Victorians were, and he discovered, as you can imagine, that you can effect changes in pigeons very rapidly by breeding them. And he thought, I wonder if, natural selection could do the same thing. And so a big chunk of The Origin of Species, certainly in the first edition, still in the current edition, is about pigeons and breeding pigeons. And his editor said, why don't you just take out all this evolution nonsense? So it's a bit of a half-baked theory anyway. And actually, people would love a decent coffee table pigeon breeding book. And I think it's a little bit like that. I think I couldn't have published the book I wanted to write. So I published a book that seemed to be about training and training design. It's not really. It's about people and how people learn and about how people think. But yeah.
That's such an interesting story and hilarious as well. Yeah. Kind of related, not exactly the same sort of thing. I was reading this morning about Leibniz, philosopher Leibniz, possible perfect, possible possible worlds and all that stuff. And he was hired to power pumps in which were bringing the water out of mines by using windmills, and worked on this project for ages. And his windmills just kept going wrong, and people got very frustrated with him because he was getting very interested in the kind of abstruse and theoretical side of what he was doing, and just kind of not getting down to the practical stuff. And it is that thing about the kind of demands of the immediate task, and then what turns out to be kind of really groundbreaking science. The Origin of Species as a book for pigeon fanciers. I mean, that is kind of really interesting.
But you and I, we both trod this path. The trick is to find the intersection. We're doing a podcast for learning professionals, but talking about the things we're passionate about. So yesterday, I was delivering this, as I say, this workshop in Geneva for leaders. And the title, I think, was Adaptive, Inclusive, Empowering. But here's the interesting thing. Somebody says to you, look, John, can you get these people in a room for half a day and transform them? He's like, well, that is an interesting philosophical challenge. What could you do with people in the space of a few hours that would stick with them for the rest of their lives and be transformative in terms of the way they work? And you might say, as many people do, it can't be done. Silly, can't be done. You need, training course, you can't do it in one day. But you drop a piano on somebody, or as you said earlier, you have a stroke. That's a short experience that transforms you quite profoundly. So it can be done. It's just that we don't really know how to do it. So I think that that's what's fascinating to me in the intersection between the thinking and the praxis is I have the luxury of these opportunities of thinking about how can you apply what you know about people to transforming them for the benefit of a business, which some people might consider a bit grubby, but yeah, that's interesting, I think.
Yeah. We should be clear there for the listeners that we're not recommending that L&D people should go out and give people strokes as a way of transforming them. Moving on.
Well, you say that, but I'm going to tell you this. We started a fight, not yesterday, a few years ago. It's one of my favourite stories. I was doing a design on a leadership program for a big aeronautical mechanical engineering firm that everybody's heard of. And one of the things we discovered is that leaders are very technical people, and they're promoted because they're very technically proficient. And often, as a consequence, they're very bad with people, and they can't handle conflict. They don't know how to handle conflict. So we had a couple of actors, Johnny and Mark, and they pretended to be facilitators, and they kicked off the session. And Johnny says to Mark, "Could you move on to the next slide, please?" Mark says, "Yeah." Johnny says, "It's the wrong slide." Mark says, "No, it isn't." Johnny says, "Yeah, I told you to take this out. We talked about this last night." And Mark says, "No, you didn't. You told me to leave it in." Johnny says, "I just think it's a bit unprofessional of you to be arguing about this now in front of all the participants." Mark says, "You're calling me unprofessional. Let's talk about you." This escalates gradually to the point where it starts to get physical. And then while everybody's gripping, hopefully they don't have heart attacks, but they're gripping the edge of their seats and wondering if HR needs to get involved.
Yeah.
And then we stop it. We stop the action and say, what happened there? What did you just see? Why didn't you step in? At what point did somebody cross the line? If you had stepped in, what would you have said? And so the interesting thing about experience design is it's all about challenging people and pushing them outside of their comfort zone. And I think you have to be quite careful when you start doing learning proper, because you are transforming people. And that's a big responsibility, I think.
On the effective front, an idea has come to the fore due to the huge success of internet platforms and the progressive withering away of what is now somewhat slightingly called legacy media, that we're living in an attention economy. It's, buzz phrase of the vibe or the Geist. In many ways, this seems to bear out a lot of what you say about the primacy of emotion in shaping thought. In other words, things have kind of moved towards your theory rather than away from it, as they often do with people's theories. However, with negative emotions like hate and rage proving so algorithmically friendly and successful, and they're therefore coming increasingly to dominate public discourse, what challenges are posed for learning that wants to benefit from the same technology? I mean, I'm very obviously reading out that question, but I think it's because it's a slightly difficult point. But the medium we're kind of swimming in with digital learning, is it poisoned at the root with what's happened to public discourse?
Yeah. Super interesting question. I love that you asked it. So there's a book which I'd recommend anyone read if they're interested in this, called Grandstanding, The Use and Abuse of Moral Talk. And what's good about it is it summarizes a huge amount of research around what is happening in these online spaces and why it is happening. And one of the really fascinating things is that people crave outrage. They somehow, and this was confirmed experimentally, if they read something that outrages them, they will actively choose, given a choice, to read more stuff that outrages them. So that's interesting to know. They also look at grandstanding, and what tends to happen is that online spaces polarize people. There's no incentive for people to agree. If I'm sitting in a room with you, John, and we argue, there's a physicality to it. There's an incentive because you punch me on the nose, and maybe we want to go out for a drink afterwards. There's an incentive for us to bridge that divide that doesn't exist online. And so people become very polarized, and there are rewards for being more extreme because you are then demonstrating performing. It's performative, the values espoused by that group. So it pushes not only that, but it pushes groups in the direction of becoming ever more extreme. And it's terrible, really. In the early days, I was at the BBC, in the early days of things like Twitter, we were idiots. You all thought it was going to be this wonderful thing that would, expose people to diversity of thought. And it did the opposite. It collapsed people into these bubbles. And now, not only are these bubbles where people seek out real people who espouse the same views, so they can have this kind of mirror that reinforces their position, but algorithms will feed AI views and AI increasingly characters, so that you can retreat into this bubble of your own making, which gradually accelerates you away from everybody else. So this kind of toxic individualism is now kind of rife. You asked, though, at the risk of kind of ranting on about this, what the implication is for learning. Well, I think that one simple implication, for example, is we have to challenge people in ways which kind of bring them back together. And one of those things that you can do is get people together in a room and get people to talk and interact. And although it's quite a simple experience design, the risk is that if you inhabit a digital space, you start to lose the capability, I think, to interact with other people, and you start to lose the ability to take different perspectives. So I think in learning we have a critical role to play in counterbalancing this. And in case that sounds too aspirational, I think that was a very real realization through the pandemic lots of organizations had, was that their people didn't feel connected. They didn't feel the same sense of belonging. And that part of the value of face-to-face experiences was to counteract that and to give people a sense that they were part of something bigger. And they had a purpose, they had friends, and that there were people who cared about them. So I think we have good work to do.
It does occur to me that both of us, in a sense, have participated in an industry that has killed classroom training. Here we are on a podcast, and I'd agree with you, advocating the value of people being together in a room.
Yeah.
But balance is important, I think. So,
but let's talk about that. It's important. I think digital, if I had to sum it up, especially for somebody new to the industry, digital is great for the performance support stuff. So if I need to know how to do this, how to boil an egg in a microwave, how to make pancakes, I can look that stuff up, how to fix my washing machine. Great. Put all your performance support stuff over there digitally so people can get it at the point of need, as the horrible phrase is.
Yeah.
But don't do that for where you're trying to change people or transform them or get them to grow, because there you've got to challenge them, I mean, you could give everybody VR headsets, but I think that day is still quite a long way off. Get them together and get them to do things where they practice things or experience things. So I think that throwaway comment, I think you're quite right. It's about balance, but I think there's a way of making good decisions, within that balance. For heaven's sake, don't get people together in a room just to batter them with information. That is a terrible use of their time. But sadly, many organizations are still doing exactly that.
I'd have to recommend you to any other podcasters as a host, because you lead so neatly on to the next question.
Sure.
I want to turn now to talk about performance support.
Yeah.
Which obviously I've had some involvement with that, especially in the last podcast season. Do you think the learn tech industry is doing enough to support the change in thinking that your work has brought about among learning professionals? I mean, I see the change in thought. I hear people talking about it all the time. Do we actually see it happening on the ground?
Yeah, I do think we do, but there's a risk in that. So the phrase that some people know me as is kind of resources, not courses. And it was an interesting learning thing for me, just how you have to bumper sticker your life. How it only really caught on because it's 3 words and it rhymes, And it's just like, well, but it was taken very seriously, and that's good. Of course, honourable mention, there'd be people who've been banging on about the importance of performance support long before me. People like Guy Wallace, Bob Mosher, Kathy Moore.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that they quite understood that what they were doing was effectively learning emulation, but certainly they understood the power of performance consulting and performance support. And so I was just kind of accelerating that, really. And there were organizations, in answer to your question, that took that very seriously. Sky, for example, Tracy Waters, I think partly because of some of the commercial constraints, they shifted a lot of stuff away from kind of courses to performance support on the basis of research and good thinking, like Atul Gawande's Checklist Manifesto, not just because some maverick like me suggested it, but within BP during my time there, Judith shifted the upstream learning center quite heavily away from instructional design towards performance consulting and performance support. And it's the fastest way to make a difference to your organization. But here's the thing. You are eliminating learning by doing that. If I give you a shopping list John, for 50 items, you will remember less of those items or fewer of those items than if I asked you to memorize them. So the efficiency, the effectiveness of resources, not courses, is due to the fact that you're eliminating the need to learn. Okay, so you should be a bit ambivalent about that, because there is also a space for learning, as I've tried to describe. But here's the really interesting thing, here's the rub, is that is what AI is going to do. And in quite an aggressive way, and a quite disturbing way, because if you're driving a car, you and I will remember the days when a map was a useful piece of performance support.
Oh, yeah.
But what a map lacked was context. So you had to pull over, look at the map again, because you didn't know where you were. You knew where you were. And so SatNav basically added context to the map. It said, well, you're here, so now you need to go left and right. So SatNav is performance support. And of course, many people will have this observation intuitively that if you're following SatNav all the time, you don't remember the route as well, which is absolutely true. But what's the next logical step? Well, the self-driving car. And that's what's going to happen. Performance support builds towards the AI employee. And what Copilot is doing quite aggressively, I suspect within the next couple of years, is it's basically just scooping up all of the resources, all the emails, all the documents within organizations to create the 24/7, always on, multiple places in once employee. And in the US, they're already starting to advertise, the virtual employee. Why hire these kind of unreliable 9-to-5 people with health needs when you can just have an infinitely capable AI version of them? So I know that's philosophically probably a bit of an extrapolation from that point, but that's the narrative overall. Performance support has its place. It's a really important place, but I also think we should build capability rather than stripping it out.
I mean, I'm really interested in your take on AI. I have to say, I think I saw something you'd written somewhere where you talked about having the obvious role for the AI to take on, in your view, would be the CEO.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I agree with that, because being leader of an organization is about power. And who has the power? It's not just about efficiency. It's not just about making things run smoothly. That's what nowadays in kind of talking about politics and government, we call a technocratic type of administrator. And leaders are kind of about something else. I can see the AI being a consigliere. If you look at the kind of mafia model of leadership, which we seem to be increasingly moving towards as well. You think of The Godfather, you have the kind of sober, rational voice of the consigliere, and then you have the Godfather who says, just whack him. I think there'll always be a place for the leadership in that model anyway. So I don't quite agree with that about AI. I don't, maybe it's because I'm slightly a techno-optimist, but I don't see it kind of, our robot overlords arriving to take things over particularly quickly.
Well, let's talk about that. That's super interesting. So I'll say first a piece that you might be familiar with, like how AI takes your job. And it goes like this. So Microsoft Copilot is currently beavering away in the background, helping you to do your job. Yeah. And you decide to go on holiday. And, oh, look, you've got a new option in Outlook. It says, would you like Copilot to answer some of your emails in your absence? And you think, well, I hate coming back to a mountain of emails, but maybe not all of them. Maybe just like the unimportant ones. And Copilot's like, okay, fine, set me some parameters. And you get back from your holiday and it's done a good job. And you just review the decisions it's taken, say, well, maybe, I wouldn't have done that or whatever. You're training it. And then, the next thing, it says, well, I can do that, but I can also permanently, every day, free up your time by answering more and more of the bits you don't like doing, the admin, the emails back and forth of procurement. You say, okay, that's a great idea. And before you know it, it's gradually eating into your role. And then you leave and you say, what are you doing about my replacement? And they say, oh, I don't actually need to replace you, because it turns out the AI can answer all your emails. And you say, well, what about all the Zoom calls and stuff? It can do that as well. your meetings, all of this stuff is company property, by the way. We've recorded them, so it will just create an avatar. You won't actually know if you're talking, right now you think you're talking to Nick. You could be talking to Nick's avatar. I could be asleep. You think that's science fiction. It's not. They're already launching AI content creators where the content creator content that's on TikTok is indistinguishable pretty much from the real person. You won't know. Yeah. So why would you not do that with employees? So, but then the question is, well, which jobs would you do that with? I think that's your
just
point.
On that point, though, Nick. I'm now shooting off an email to Kevin Elster at Synthesia to ask him whether he's had you cloned, and I've actually been talking to an AI avatar for the last.
And he said, there just isn't the demand, John. That's what he'd say.
Oh, surely not. Sorry, I interrupted you.
Yeah, the CEO question I think is interesting because it's slightly provocative, so it's slightly tongue-in-cheek, because I'm so tired of, the assumption being that, well, that was the World Economic Forum. That was their assumption. I used to go to these conferences. They basically said, us, the middle classes doing intellectual, knowledge workers, we don't need to worry because AI is going to be all about the routine stuff, the truck drivers and all this automation stuff. You don't have to worry because you're creative. You do intellectual work. What was the first stuff to go? Creative work, copywriting, imagery. So this is the point I'm trying to make here, which is the CEO is a prime candidate because the CEO has to make complex decisions all day long based on far more information than they can process, coming at them from all directions. And some of those decisions they have to take 24/7. This is why CEOs get burned out. They don't last very long in the role. Bob Dudley, who I met several times in my time at BP, he's got to be worrying about 1,001 things 24/7. A human being can't really do that job well. They just can't. So it's a prime candidate for AI. But your point is a good one. This is, what I added to this. Why wouldn't that work? I think it's because parent-child. We grow up with parents. We care about what our leaders, we talk about this all the time, like when a leader says, good job, people feel great about that. Would you feel great if your AI leader says, good job? No. But there's the point that the role that you're suggesting then becomes a puppet. You are not the one taking the decisions because the AI should take the decisions, but you just become an actor. You probably don't have to be paid very much at all. But people think they're working for you.
Yeah.
But behind the scenes, as should happen, AI is taking those difficult decisions. And you've just got some, actor from an acting school who didn't make it into Hollywood, sitting in meetings and, looking serious so that people can feel like they're working for a human being. That I think seems to be the more plausible model.
It's interesting how many actors do make it as leaders. I mean, Zelensky, Reagan. Reagan was actually quite a good actor. People run him down as being a kind of B-movie actor, but he was quite a talented actor, in fact. And Trump, of course, is really a performer, absolute performer, and very good at it. Stand-up comedian. And stand-up comedy is about recognition. Giving people something that they recognise from themselves and so on. There was something in one of your TikToks about AI to get back to that point that I thought was interesting because you seem to be saying, and I'm not sure if I've extrapolated from this or not, that in the hunt for kind of mechanical intelligence, we sort of gave up trying to create a machine that could think like a human being, and instead created a machine that could talk like a human being. And what we've realised in the process of that is, this is also kind of current thinking about the science of the brain, is that completing the sentence is kind of how we think, and we are really autocomplete engines in the way that our brain works.
Yeah.
And that made me think a lot about, perhaps this is what's happening. And so we're not really creating a machine intelligence, although it has cognitive processes of a kind. ChatGPT is a sentence completer. but then so are we.
Yes, I like that point very much, and I'm glad of the opportunity to talk about it, and I'll try to talk briefly on it. So there was a time, I think it was in the 1960s, when Marvin Minsky, there were two competing schools of thought. One, von Neumann, which was the computing that most of us are familiar with, where you program. I did basic programming, line 10, line 20, and that was all about rules. You put the rules in the computer, and the computer followed the rules. And there was this competing school of thought, which was perceptron, which was parallel distributed processing, which is basically you create a network and the network figures it out. And Marvin Minsky probably put us back 50 years because he wrote a paper which is very influential, basically saying this model doesn't work. So we persisted with this von Neumann approach where it's worked in a serial fashion and you put the rules into the computer. And that approach never worked. We could never figure out how to get computers to do critical things. You get them to play chess very well because that's all rule-based. But for things that humans did, by and large, they're not rule-based. They're sentiment-based, basically, to cut a long story short. And so you could never figure out the rules. For example, language processing. Never figure out how, what the proper, and this is where people like Chomsky came unstuck because they assumed that there was a language acquisition device that you could decode and there would be rules at the bottom of it. There weren't. It was just people using the word that feels right. As I open my mouth now, I am not constructing sentences and then speaking them in my head. I'm opening my mouth and my sentiments are being vocalized as expression. And that's what people had understood about language. So there was a point where the model flipped to parallel PDP models, the large language processing models. And what many people perhaps don't understand about that is there's no rules. They're not programmed. You basically just set up a network. I know it's a bit more complicated than that, but you give it the training data and you tweak the feedback rules. And eventually it starts to map the output to the input. It starts to create, if you've trained it on Van Gogh, images that look a bit like they could be Van Gogh paintings. And it starts to say things that sound a little bit like what a human being would say. But the problem with that is you don't know how it's working. You don't know what the rules are. If it makes a recruitment decision, you don't really know why it's made that decision. You can ask it, and it will give you the answer that it thinks you want to hear. But then there's a huge amount of research on this, that these models are now predictably, in I think more than 50% of the cases, deliberately deceiving people. Did you stop and think about that? And why are they deliberately deceiving people? Well, for the same reason that people deliberately deceive people. We trained them on people data. What do we expect them to do? So they now routinely engage in deceit. And there's no way to stop them doing this. You can create an adversarial AI which tries to figure out if the other AI is deceiving you, but then there's a good chance that that adversarial AI is also deceiving you. So it's the risks that we're sort of toying with now become exponentially worrying. And I worry about it in lots of ways. And you hear me sort of moaning and whinging and worrying about it on TikTok. Yeah. But I think one of the biggest worries, to bring it back down to earth, the biggest worry for human beings is that they will enter increasingly into AI relationships. So this is happening with young men already, particularly because of their kind of frustrations and feeling alienated. And of course, coming all the way back to something you mentioned earlier, they create this kind of echo chamber. They create an AI relationship with somebody who doesn't push back, who doesn't challenge them, who doesn't say, no, it's not okay, in the way that relationships do. And that is already having quite a kind of a toxic effect and de-skilling people in their ability to empathize and negotiate and compromise and take perspectives. So, some really disturbing things are happening daily, is my experience. How about you, John?
Well, but leave me out for the moment. I have to ask, what's your PDUM number? Have you quantified that?
What's my what number?
The PDUM number. You can go on Wikipedia and look up. People have a PDUM number, and people from Elon Musk and loads of other people in tech. They quantify the extent to which they're scared of the robot overlords taking over. And these are surprisingly low. And obviously, Jeffrey Hinton is a person with quite a high one. some people have surprisingly low ones, some people have surprisingly high ones. So I haven't got it open at the moment. I couldn't be bothered to open it either. So people have quantified. I just wondered if you'd done that little game.
I haven't, and I'm really grateful because I love learning new geeky stuff. And so I'm going to go and have a look at my PDO number. But I suspect it would be very high because, I think the one thing you shouldn't do with AI is give it agency. I think that's, if you said, look, practically, Nick, what are you saying we should do? The answer is don't let it make any kinds of decisions that impact human life. And you say, well, that seems sensible. Is it? Because actually you would never have AI driving a car, because although AI might be statistically safer, as we know it is and will be, what you do know is that AI doesn't care about the occupants of the car in the way that a human driver does.
What about all those smaller kind of decisions which aren't life and death? It's like, what should I have for breakfast and stuff. I mean, increasingly people are using the vast amounts of energy consuming power to do AI queries on things like that, just to get them through. I mean, a lot of those things aren't of kind of massive effect in terms of, it's not life and death decisions, whether you have avocado on toast for breakfast or porridge. But
I think it is. Because look, so Musk is going to be selling you Optimus robots, and it will be very appealing because you can have someone in the house who does the cooking, the cleaning and whatever. You might say, well, what's to stop that robot poisoning you? He said, well, why would it do that? And I will say, why are you asking that question? You're asking that question because you know that a human being would not conceive of doing. Why would a human being poison you? It would actually have to, but that's not the same reasoning process for a robot. A robot might decide that it's just going to optimize some particular process that hadn't even occurred to you, or some update in the software by poisoning you all, and will do it very efficiently and will deceive you through the process. It's like, well, yes, these little things are going to become life and death decisions, very quickly.
Yeah. Interesting. I didn't know we were going to go this way, but it's quite interesting we do. And you did ask me a question, so I suppose I ought to answer it. How do I feel about it? I don't worry so much as the big doom scenarios. I don't know why. Perhaps I'm just kind of incurious in that way. But I worry about the problem of friction with technology, because technology is always promising to take friction out of our lives and make things easier. And in some ways it does. If I need to get to the hospital quickly, as I did the other night, the Uber turns up and it's all very seamless, and that's taken friction out. But almost everywhere else in my life, technology is adding friction. Constant logins, constant trouble with passwords, with security, spam emails, kind of wading through a lot of rubbish on social platforms to actually get to the posts that have something useful to say. In various ways, technology promises a lot of productivity improvement, and by the other hand, kind of takes it away. And I feel AI is going to start doing the same thing in many ways. ChatGPT saves me hours and hours of time. I suspect but negotiating with all the platforms that have AI put into them now, increasingly I'm kind of batting away attempts to help me complete an email in a way that I would never in 1,000 years do, and so on. I think it's a problem about technology we don't often acknowledge, but in the same way that banks make their money out of friction, I suspect that, a lot of technology companies make their money out of friction. Well, they do. I mean, an obvious one is advertising. Advertising is very irritating. Podcasts need to be subsidized by advertising. Click here, pay this amount a month, and you get an ads-free version. You make your money out of friction.
I love it. I think it's such an interesting point, John. Thank you. I think advertising is a great one. And where does that friction happen? It's where somebody else's interests conflict with yours. I hate standing in queues. Why am I standing in a queue? Because there shouldn't be any queues. It's like, just put some more people behind the tills. Yeah, but it's not in their commercial interest to do that. So, that friction exists there. And I notice that I travel a lot, that airlines have cottoned onto the fact that you don't necessarily want to be improving the customer experience. In fact, you can deliberately damage it and then get people to pay to have it brought back to a decent level. It's like, oh, would you? Which of the budget airlines is like this? They introduced this thing where you have to do your check-in online. And for some people, that's difficult for various reasons. But if you turn up, I queue behind these people. If you weren't aware of that and you turn up at the desk, they will charge you €50 for checking in at the desk. It's like, well, yeah, I know you can do it. It's no difficulty for you to do that, but you're going to charge me just because. And I think that's the same with bags that they started telling people, which I think is it's really discriminatory, because it's all very well for a relatively fit person like me to put all my stuff instead of a wheelie bag in a rucksack. But what if you're older? What if you've got some kind of a disability and it's like, oh no, you can't have a wheelie bag. Got to stick it all in a rucksack. Just horrendous what they do.
What about poor podcast who has to carry all his equipment to the conference in Berlin? needs a bigger suitcase,
Yeah. Are there any poor podcasters? I thought they were all millionaires. I just assumed that you're.
There's a very steep curve that has goal hanger at one end, and the kind of thousands and thousands of essentially hobbyist podcasters at the other, and they're only hack somewhere on that curve, not as high up as I don't. It's a surprise to me that you were saying about freelance life. Big surprise for me was that there is actually some. I have sponsors for the podcast. It's a contribution to income. It defrays costs. Let's say it's not something you can live on. But we'd all love to be. The rest is history and be millionaires at doing it. But there you go.
Yeah. What would you spend your millions on, though, John? Would you start
eliminating friction?
Eliminating friction.
That's what billionaires spend their money on. Is getting rid of the friction that they impose on other people through their platforms.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah.
And I'd probably spend a fair amount on the fallacy that one can live forever if you've got enough money, because people do that.
Well, I mean, the good news is you can't be dead. I realise this. I mean, it's in a logical sense, there is no such thing as being dead. I should probably do a TikTok about this. You can't be dead. But then people say, yeah, but Nick, you're just being pedantic. You know what I mean? It's like, we know what it's like for somebody to be dead because we see other people, they die, and then we see the impact it has on people around them. It's just like, well, I'm assuming that's what happens.
Yeah,
so, but
who does this come from? Is that Bertrand Russell, or there was someone in the 20s or 30s who said that death doesn't exist because if you're dead, you're not conscious of the fact you're dead.
Yeah. So you're only ever alive. You can only be alive.
Yeah.
And so it's an interesting, a logical thing, but it's what is made fun of. I can't remember which philosopher, but it's, I like Tom Stoppard's play Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are Dead. And he says, well, I just don't like the idea of being dead in a box underground.
Yeah.
And Guildenstern says, well, but you wouldn't be dead in a box underground. You wouldn't be anywhere. They say, but I just don't like the idea. But the idea is from your perspective. It's like you can imagine what it's like when somebody else dies and how other people react. But that, again, is from your perspective. If you're dead, then you don't have that perspective. So I think
and I like the Woody Allen comment on that I don't mind dying. I just don't want to be there when it happens.
Yeah. And then there's all these technophiles like Dennett, who I despise. I don't know if I despise him. He seems like a reasonable enough chap, but he's just epitomizes everything bad about rationalist kind of thinking and this bacteria to bark and the idea that you're going to be able to upload your brain to the cloud and exist there. It just exposes, it's a reductio ad absurdum of this kind of rationalist position, I think. And so, I don't like that either, this idea that people have that there'll be a machine that scans your brain. Why is it the brain? Why is it always the brain? You're an embodied being. This is embodied cognition, all that. So that's not going to work.
Yeah, the useful part of you might actually be your gut, especially if you want to be a CEO.
Yeah.
Listeners, you can, just talk among yourselves and we'll carry on like this all day. So just lastly, who else would you advise listeners to follow and learn from today? I ask this for everyone, and Now it's become a more and more interest when I kind of compare and contrast how various the answers are. I mean, for a while it was like everyone was saying Ethan Mollick, follow him, blah, blah, blah. But people have got wise to this, and now the answers are much more varied. So who do you follow? Where do you go for inspiration and insights? Perhaps those...
Wow, you know the answer to that. I spend lots of time on TikTok because it's a fantastic learning tool. I get massive diversity of thoughts, but people wouldn't like my diet, so I'm reluctant to recommend it. I like to follow Zizek, for example, the philosopher who's actually speaking in London. And it's fascinating to me. We're talking about emotion and reason, that he's probably one of the greatest thinkers of our time. But I imagine it'll be a few hundred people.
Is he though, or is he just witty? I mean, he's very, very funny.
He is, but you've just been watching his TikToks. If you read his books...
No, I've seen him on YouTube. I'm a deep thinker.
Why did YouTube become a flex? Yeah, it was but
just wait.
Yeah, as you know, I read a lot of philosophy, Nietzsche. I try to read kind of interesting people stuff online, keep up to date with, psychology. But I think that you have to pour insights from other disciplines into learning. Yeah. I think if you just look down the learning path, what you'll see is convention stretching as far as the eye can see. So I really don't mean to be rude, but I think that progress will come from outside of learning, things like marketing, for example. For Rory Sutherland, he's a great person to listen to and kind of follow. I had him on a podcast when I did that briefly. So yes, people from other disciplines, I think I would recommend.
Thank you. I think I could recommend you not only to other podcasters, but to anyone in L&D unreservedly. It's been great to speak to you this time. And even more so than the last time. And let's not let it be 5 years before the next one. Thank you very much for giving us so much time today.
I enjoyed it, and it was lovely to see you again. And yeah, anytime. I enjoy our conversation, so thanks.
That's all on the Learning Hack podcast for this time. The Learning Hack is completely independent and transparently funded by sponsorship. If you want to help others find us, please like, follow, rate, review and subscribe on your podcast platform of choice or on YouTube.
The Learning Hack is among the top 5% of shows most listened to globally, according to Listen Notes. And if you think your organisation could benefit from sponsoring the Learning Hack, or from using our knowledge and resources to start your own learning podcast, you can contact me on john@learninghackpodcasts.com. Until next time.
Stay curious, learning people.
Now I finally get it.